Yep, I've sent that request now, and she should be now promoted. Wonderful. So yes, we do now have quorum.
Amazing. Naomi, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining today's Data Implementation Subcommittee of the Equity Advisory Committee. I believe I'm supposed to ask the clerk for a roll call.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Carrie Akimi Hernandez. Carrie Akimi Hernandez. Abamel Chavez Hernandez. Florence Simon.
Here.
Chair Naomi Iwasaki.
Here.
Martha Armis Kelly. And then one more time for Carrie Akimi Hernandez.
Carrie, if you're speaking, you're on mute.
Carrie, if you can hear us, please confirm and indicate your presence. Do you see her online? She did respond earlier. I know she was sounded like she was traveling on the phone, but one more time, Carrie Akimi Hernandez, if you can hear us, please indicate your presence.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, Chair, we have quorum.
Thank you, clerk. And I forgot to introduce myself, Naomi Iwasaki. I live in Los Angeles in Caltrans District 7, and I'm the chair of this subcommittee. Next, we have our land acknowledgement, and I'd like to open it up to the subcommittee to see if anyone is interested in giving the land acknowledgement. I'm not sure if we have a slide where folks could read it. If not, I'm happy to read the land acknowledgement. Okay, next time I'll plan better and ask one of our members if they would like to read so that we can all participate in this, but I'll go ahead and start. We acknowledge that the land that we now call California is the ancestral lands of the over 100 nations, tribes, and peoples. The indigenous peoples of this area have a deep reciprocal relationship with the land as its original stewards. Their ways, methods, and traditions have contributed to California's rich biodiversity and have impacted the transportation network for the state. We stand with indigenous communities and are committed to partnering and advocating for a more equitable and sustainable future. Our transportation network not only connects us to families, friends, work, and leisure, it connects us to our past and future. We embrace our past with a future commitment to inclusiveness and equity for everyone who calls this state home. Okay. And then now I'll ask the clerk if there is anyone from the public wishing to make a public comment or items not on the agenda.
Thank you, Chair. Not seeing any requests at this time to comment.
Okay, thank you. And for members, is anyone willing to make a motion to adopt the, is it June meeting minutes?
Motion.
Thank you, Commissioner Simon. Do I have a second? No, we lost folks. Can I second? If I'm allowed to second, I second.
Justin, I think we lost Carrie, so I don't know if we have quorum to make a motion.
Yes,
anymore.
correct. Chair Iwasaki, yes, you can make the motion, but we no longer have quorum to take the vote at this time. We can come back to this item once Carrie is able to reestablish connection.
Okay, thank you. So then I believe we move on to topic discussion on our agenda. I'd like to introduce agenda item number 5, which is a Caltrans Equity Index update. And I believe presenters are Henry McKay from the Caltrans Director's Office of Sustainability and Macy Noorani from the Caltrans Director's Office of Equity and Tribal Affairs.
Thank you. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. So you all can see my screen, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Macy Noorani. I am the Data Policy Advisor in the Director's Office of Equity and Tribal Affairs under Caroline Abrams. And my work focus is to develop EQI use cases, basically. And today we are going to walk you through some EQI background development process and some technical overview and EQI use cases that we've been working. And just a reminder that you received a high-level presentation on the EQI at the June subcommittee meeting, and today we'll provide a deep dive technical overview of the tool as requested. And here is the agenda for the presentation today. And so Caltrans began developing the EQI in 2021. Early engagement focused on state agency partners, internal and external advisory group, MPOs, and RCPAs. During the summer of 2022, the EQI team primarily worked on the technical development of the beta version of EQI and tested the outputs to evaluate population coverage and other statistics. Another round of engagement kicked off with an information session in early fall of 2022, where the EQI concept was presented to more than 100 key partners, and feedback was solicited through a survey following the session. During the fall of 2022, the beta version of the EQI was presented at the California Transportation Commission meeting, and additional meetings were held with partners, including with disability advocacy groups and Caltrans safety program, to discuss specific aspects of the index. Throughout 2023, our team disseminate information about the tool to introduce people to the beta version and continue to solicit feedback from our partners on the technical aspects of the tool. This was done through a series of in-depth information sessions, a public comment period for both internal and external partners, and early engagement with the Interagency Equity Advisory Committee. Our team continued to develop and refine the tool and officially launched version 1.0 in March of 2024. And since then, our team has been focused on integrating the tool into Caltrans policies and processes through various use cases. And with that, I'll hand it over to Henry for the EQI version 1.0 technical overview.
Thanks, Macy, and great to be here. I'll just introduce myself real quick. My name is Henry McKay. I'm the Transportation Analysis Branch Manager in the Director's Office of Sustainability. So we work very closely with ETA and helped develop the tool, mostly focused on sort of the technical GIS data science aspects of it. So today I'm mostly going to walk through kind of the technical aspects of the tool, the data that goes into it, the methodology choices we made when developing the tool, and how it works. but I do kind of want to start out with just like, what is the purpose of the EQI from a higher level compared to other tools like CalEnviroScreen and things like that. Really, when we started developing EQI, at the time there were a lot of other spatial equity tools being used, including by Caltrans. And what we really wanted to do was kind of not reinvent the wheel, but develop something that was a little bit more tailored to our needs and kind of filled a gap in the available tools at the time. And so I'd say two of the primary purposes of developing the tool were one, to have something that was really transportation focused. And so was focused just on transportation issues. Of course, there's a lot of equity issues out there, including ones that kind of have a transportation nexus but might not really be directly transportation related. But we wanted to get one where the through line between like our decision making as a department was really clear and kind of the data we were seeing. So that was one big reason, was to have just a tool that had a more direct connection to the decisions we were trying to make. And then two was to develop something that was a little bit more spatially granular. If you've worked with census data and spatial data, most of the time these tools are built at the tract level, and this can be okay in some densely populated urban areas, but tracts are pretty large, especially out in the rural and suburban parts of the state. And so we use blocks, and for the most part, most of the data we include in the tool are data sets that we developed and have kind of more control over. So we're able to get a more granular neighborhood level view of these transportation issues, many of which are pretty granular in nature. So basically that just means you need to look at smaller geographic units to be able to assess where those issues are effectively. So there's other considerations there, but those were kind of two of the high level drivers of why we went about creating this tool. So with that, I'll get into the specifics. Overall, EQI has a pretty limited set of indicators compared to other tools. And again, this is pretty intentional. We want it to be really clear when you see results in the EQI, exactly what that means in a transportation sense, and there to be a really clear idea of like what potential solutions could help address those issues. And so it's easier to do that generally with fewer indicators. And so we were pretty intentional about what we included. But generally, the indicators are all grouped together into three primary categories. First, with the demographic data, we're looking at household income and low-income households specifically, as well as tribal land status. And then we have two specific, transportation indicator groupings: traffic exposure, which is basically looking at transportation burdens. So it's looking at places with high exposure to traffic, as well as crashes. And so really calculating like where are the negative externalities of our transportation system the most present. And then with access to destinations, we're really looking at this as like a transportation benefit. So, when you can use the transportation system to get to the places you need to get to easily, that's a benefit that's being provided. But you have that benefit to varying degrees. You might be able to drive somewhere really quickly in 15 minutes, or I guess it's kind of a long drive in some places, but it might take 3 times as long to take transit somewhere. That's certainly kind of the case where I live. And so we're able to quantify that pretty precisely across a few different transportation modes and really understand where are the gaps in our system. So where are people really lacking in that benefit that they should have access to. So I'll get into that a little bit more in a sec, but that's the high level idea in terms of what indicators we're including. So for the demographic indicators, again, household income and tribal land status, these are fairly simple, and we're really using existing data sets and methodologies. For household income, we basically use the AB 1550 low income definition. And so that is just communities, so in this case, census block groups, that are at or below 80% of the statewide median household income, or are below or at or below what the Department of Housing and Community Development defines as low income, taking into account the local cost of living of a given county, as well as household size. And so that's all to say, there's different ways of measuring income status. And this is a pretty good one for a statewide tool like the EQI, at least we think, because it's able to kind of capture those low income places that might not be low income compared to, another place across the state, but they're low income per the context of that region. And so, some other tools don't really capture the Bay Area all that well. This, at least on the income side, this definition does a good job of capturing those areas that, people might think are high income, but per, the actual income levels of the county, they're fairly low income. And then for tribal land status, we're just looking at census blocks that intersect or are contained within tribal lands. And so it's a fairly simple sort of yes or no decision point there. So if either of those criteria are met, the block is sort of screened by the demographic indicators. Next slide. So next I'll talk a little bit about the traffic exposure indicators. And again, this is really looking at, the externalities of transportation, or the negative externalities specifically. And so we have two metrics or two indicators here: traffic proximity and volume, and crash exposure. I'll get into these in a little bit more detail each. But ultimately, these are metrics we developed in-house and we use, and we ultimately represent them as a percentile value. So we say, for a given census block, the traffic exposure value, for example, is greater than X percent of other blocks in the state. And so we kind of get a relative sense of how impacted a given area is. This is ultimately at least percentiles are a methodology used in a lot of other tools, including Cal and Screen. And so for both the traffic proximity and volume and crash exposure indicators, we're using the 80th percentile as the threshold. So we're kind of capturing the worst or the most impacted 20% of places in the state. Next slide. So I'll go through some of these technical slides kind of briefly, but if there's any questions, we'd be happy to answer them or get more in the weeds on any of this stuff. For traffic proximity and volume, what we really need to understand is, where is traffic located in the state? How much traffic is there? And then more, information about that traffic, and notably like what percent of it is truck traffic, because trucks have a different impact than cars do typically. And so we get public data from the federal government, the Highway Performance Monitoring System, or HPMS data set, which tells us for all the basically major roads in California, what the level of traffic is and how much traffic is truck traffic. So we take that, we do some GIS analysis essentially, and taking into account how close a given census block is to the traffic source. So, if it's 500 meters away, that's going to have less impact than if it's 100 meters away. And then we also look at sort of how different traffic sources come together. So there's a lot of places where, you might be within a certain distance of a major highway, but also close to a really busy arterial. So in those cases, there's sort of double the impact, or at least, additive impact. And so the tool is able to capture that as well. And then we look at the traffic volumes and look at the truck traffic as well. And so that final score is really accounting for those three things. How close to the different traffic sources are you? How much of that traffic that you're exposed to is made up of truck traffic? And that's weighted 6 times higher than the non-truck traffic. And then just how much overall traffic there is also determines it. And so we do some weighting, like you can see here on the graph on the right. This is showing how we treat distance. So if you're 50 meters away, you get a weight of 1. All the way out to 500 meters, it's weighted at 0.1. And you can see this relationship. And this is broadly consistent with the methodology used in the US EPA's environmental justice screen tool that we were looking at the time, kind of for some inspiration on this. We do some things differently, but it's generally, that was a decision made to be consistent with other tools. Next slide, please. So I'll show a map of what this specific indicator looks like. It looks kind of what you'd expect it to based on what's going into it. The areas, those high percentile, above 80th percentile areas are typically going to be around major highways, places where there's a lot of traffic volume. But what we also see is there's places, where traffic comes together. So, where highways, where there's big interchanges, and then also just places where the local system that can still be quite busy, intersects with our system. We see a lot of impact there as well. But that's really what we're seeing in the maps. And then, of course, there's going to be places that are less impacted by traffic, just either aren't near major traffic sources or are near sources, but they're pretty low volume. Next slide, please. So next, we'll talk about the other indicator in this grouping, which is crash exposure. And crash exposure and traffic exposure have a lot in common. Typically places that see more traffic exposure just have more crashes, just as a function of there being more traffic. But we do look at crashes sort of specifically as a separate thing here, and we do it a little bit differently. And so we get data from the Transportation Injury Mapping System, which is a really cool project from UC Berkeley, which looks at crash data from CHP, but then does a really good job of geocoding some of the missing data, and then looking specifically at crashes involving bicyclists and pedestrians. So they do a really important job of filling in a big data gap. So we use their data just because it has generally more location accuracy. And then we remove crashes from controlled access facilities. And so this is kind of a thing that usually raises a lot of questions, but there is a really specific reason for doing it. And it's that we're looking at a very specific type of crash. And what we care about in the equity index is sort of that nexus between crashes and equity outcomes. And so unfortunately, we don't really have very good data on who's getting into crashes and where they live. So we're not really able to make at least data-driven and really specific claims about, okay, a given road segment is experiencing these crashes, and these are the demographics of the folks getting those crashes. Yeah, Martha, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm wondering, did you ever like think to like maybe reach out to academia that's doing this type of research already, like Street Story and the UC Berkeley that's looking at near misses in various corridors and has identified different neighborhoods of disproportioned backgrounds where they're dealing with a lot of these nexuses between corridors and boulevards and freeways, and how they're quantifying these accidents. And when you say that you're gathering data in regards to specific, you're not being specific to us as to what you're delineating and looking for. And my issue with data is that many times it's used to create a narrative, but it's not a narrative that is assuming all areas of equity and the areas of barrier that most of our neighborhoods and communities are facing. So that's my concern, because when we use these words, we have to be really intentional about what we're thinking about. What are we trying to have out of the data? Because the data can be swayed and it can be also influencing, created to influence different outcomes. And that's something that I think that, not all of us here are as limited as yourself and would just take it as verbatim rather than to really understand the weeds of what you're saying.
Thanks for the comment, Martha. I had a follow-up question on that. There's a few things there. Was one of them kind of a concern that we're not accounting for, like there's these other crash types that we're not, like the near misses you mentioned, that we're not capturing, and there's a lot of other elements.
I mean,
yeah.
See, the biggest issue for us as community is to understand that sometimes things have to happen in order for things to actually happen. And that we should be proactive rather than reactive. If there's a curve there and it's showing an indicator for a high proximity, high indicator for possibility of an incident, then we need to direct our attention to that rather than wait for it to cause something that could be avoided. And that right there is using data that's already being gathered from community. What community has is a lot of qualitative, and it's been a big chasm for us to be able to take that qualitative analysis and turn it into quantitative. And UC Berkeley has come in with the solution. They are actually at the source, at the community, gathering information as to what has happened, put it in an index, and that is available to yourselves. It's not something that they're keeping and saying we don't want to share. It's available so that these kinds of projects, these kinds of indexes that were created are really robust, not just one-sided or in one direction, but really intentional about getting a bigger picture, bigger perspective.
I totally agree with the point you're making. I would say, yeah, this is the 1.0 version. I would like to follow up and learn more about the UC Berkeley project you're talking about. I'm familiar with some of their work on this, and there are certain like some of the considerations here are just, you know, some there's been a lot of great work, like you're saying, on the near misses thing, and some of that's more transferable to like a statewide thing, just because there are data gaps. But that's certainly something we want to improve on. So I appreciate the comment and the feedback.
And the other thing is climate. We really have to look when we're creating, if this is 1.0, then we really have to make sure we embed climate, you know, the climate justice portion of it, because I'm going to tell you something. Recently, just even 2 years ago, when we were out on the 99 doing a big project of widening and fixing of the 99 corridor, there were accidents that happened because we did not take considerations for environment and climate. At the time, we were in what they call an atmospheric river situation, where there was many changes and many flooding, areas of flooding. And then we moved the project further down the 99. And I don't believe that we've even taken that consideration in those tunnels or those aisle spaces that we created so the cars would follow. They became a trap, a death trap, so to speak. And we need to look at that. We need to look at that when we're actually looking at creating spaces or even widening. How are we going to mitigate those outcomes? And that entails even how to vet out the water. How do we stream out the water from those areas where we know they're going to be full of water because of the shape or the topography of that said region? So those are things that you need to really add into that, because there have been accidents that have been caused by climate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for the feedback. On the crash exposure thing, just the main, I guess, methodological point I want to make here, which is it's kind of tricky, but is that, like I was saying, we have a big data gap, and so it is hard to understand what, like in all our facilities, the crashes, the demographics of the people getting in the crashes, like we look at for the low income and the tribal lands. And so what we do specifically is we're looking at crashes that are sort of expected to have more of that neighborhood nexus and have an impact on the people living there, and are more likely to involve people living in the areas where they're from, or where they live. And so the idea there basically is that, like, you can look in Sacramento, and I-5 runs at least on one side through a fairly affluent neighborhood, and there are quite a few crashes on I-5 just because it's a big, very busy highway, but it's controlled access. But there's sound walls. The highway is very separated from the surrounding community, and so that's just to say, like, a crash occurring there is probably going to have a different impact on the community next to it. And it's also the people driving on it are less likely to be from the community right there than maybe other facilities we have or main streets. And so those crashes are going to be different than crashes, say, on a main street with someone walking and biking who might live nearby and is walking to the store. And so that's obviously a very high level generalization, but it is an important one. And just that we have so many different types of facilities, and we have these controlled access, freeways, main streets, and whatnot. And so we do try to look at it in that way. Although we do want to make this metric better, just depending on the available data we can get, and to look at it more broadly. Next slide, please. So this shows a map of that crash exposure indicator. It's fairly similar in a lot of ways to the traffic proximity and volume. So we do see that, again, a lot of places where there's a lot of traffic, have high crash exposure, but there are some different areas as well. So we use these two in conjunction, and basically if a given block meets the criteria for any of these, so it's either high traffic exposure or high crash exposure, then it sort of meets the criteria. And in many cases, they both meet the criteria, and they both have pretty high exposure. Next slide, please. So next we're going to talk about access to destinations indicators. So these are looking really at transportation benefits and where there's a lack of benefit. And so I'll break this down a little bit as well, kind of on the data side. But ultimately what we did is we operationalized each of these as ratios. And why we did that is because transportation accessibility or accessibility broadly, access to destinations is a transportation and land use metric. So there's sort of the mobility component of it, of how fast can you get places? If you have the new protected bike lane, maybe you can take a more direct route than you could before, or you have an express bus that gets you somewhere faster. That's a mobility thing. But if there's not useful destinations on the other side of that transportation, then to what extent does it really matter? And so accessibility captures both of those things. But with that being said, Caltrans has less control over land use than we do transportation. Maybe there is interest in ways of affecting land use since there is such that close transportation land use relationship. But at the end of the day, we are a transportation department, and that's what a lot of our influence involves. And so what these ratios do is they essentially isolate the gap in the accessibility kind of equation to access that is lost because of transportation gaps. And so I'll explain a little bit more what that means, but it's meant to really identify where the issues that our system or the transportation system is causing, not necessarily just like a lack of destinations, although that is certainly a really important part of the equation still, and it's important, but it's just one that Caltrans has less direct control over, and is it's more difficult to solve for in the long term. Next slide, please. So when we talk about access to destinations, really what we're doing is just calculating how many destinations we can reach on a given mode of transportation. And so you could think of, if you use Google Maps, if you're at your house and you plug in some random destination and you look at the transit directions, and it tells you, okay, you can go walk to this spot and get on this bus that comes every 30 minutes, take this bus here, and then maybe transfer somewhere else, and then you ultimately get there, and that's going to be like 65 minutes of travel time or something like that. All the accessibility calculations do is just do those type of calculations, but for every little area in the state. And then we can tie that to destinations. And so we can calculate for a given origin point, how many jobs can one reach? How many grocery stores? How many schools? How many hospitals can someone get to using different modes of transportation? And this is really useful because we can actually go in and, look at, okay, how do the different modes of transportation compare? So, you can generally reach more things driving than by taking other modes, which is kind of an issue. And so we can look at where those inequities are. And then also look at the network in a more nuanced way, like look at where there's sidewalk gaps, or, where the bike facilities are lacking, and incorporate that into the analysis. So that's essentially what we're doing here. We do also weight the destinations. We do analysis by how far they are to get to. So destinations that are close by are weighted higher as well. Yeah, Martha.
That's good that you were adding that, because my question was going to be, what about the time gaps?
Yep.
Like if you can obviously get to a destination, but how many buses did it take to get to that destination from that given area or that source point? And and were there gaps in traveling? Did that person have to go all the way around just to get to there? And actually, how many destination points are there in that given space of time? Because you are aware that sometimes there may be a bus that comes through there, but that's the only route and the only time that it'll come through there. So when you're looking at jobs, and the equity of that said job, if you don't have transportation and you miss that 8 o'clock bus, you're not going to be able to go to work for that day, because that bus won't be coming back but one time, and that's to drop off. So, I mean, that is something that if you're really looking at creating equity in those readings or matrix, you would want to include something that would make that correlation and that argument for said point.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And a lot of times the way transit access has been assessed is it's a pretty simple metric, but it's like, how close to a bus stop are you? And, maybe that tells you something, like being close to a bus stop versus not, like, is a difference. But it's not a super impactful one because it's like, is being next to the bus stop that only one bus route serves, that goes once a day, that goes to maybe the wrong place. Like, how useful is that really? It's probably closer to not being useful than it is to being fully useful, maybe for your particular case. And so with these metrics, we're able to get a more, I would say, nuanced view of that. I mean, it's not perfect, but it kind of assesses, the overall quality of the transit that's being provided and other things like that. So I'll get a little bit more into how this looks because it covers a few different concepts. So next slide, please, Macy. This is starting out with transit access to destinations. And for transit, it's pretty simple. We just look at the ratio of transit access to auto access for a given location. And so what all this does is really assesses, how effective is transit realistically compared to driving. And we find that in places where there are really built out transit systems, there are still gaps. In like downtown San Francisco, there's a lot of transit relative to the rest of the state. And you can get to about 30-something% of the destinations that you can drive to. So that's kind of the highest level. In a lot of places, it's like closer to 1 or 2%. But what we're able to do is just kind of assess relative to auto, how effective is transit in destination access. And it normalizes it because, in some places there might just be fewer destinations. So your accessibility is going to be lower than it is in San Francisco, but that might not really matter because, it's just not a major job center in the same way. And so looking at this ratio just kind of normalizes by that and compares the relative basis of transit accessibility in a given region. Next slide. We also have metrics that look at bike and pedestrian access. So starting with the bike access, what we do is we also look at a ratio, but it's a little bit different. We look at the ratio of bike access on the low stress bike network compared to bike access on just the total network. And what that's really quantifying is like, you can technically bike a lot of places, but most people wouldn't want to, and it would be very unsafe to do that. And so when we look at, access on anywhere where you could technically ride a bicycle versus where most people would feel comfortable riding a bicycle, we find that there's a massive gap there, and we're able to kind of quantify to what degree that gap exists. And so this is really rooted around the concept of bicycle level of traffic stress. And you can see the visual down here of, this level of traffic stress for facility. So 4 means just higher stress essentially, where it's this big arterial road with no bike facilities. You could technically bike there legally, but most people wouldn't want to, and it wouldn't be a very safe idea or a comfortable experience. Juxtaposed with level of traffic stress 1 over here on the left, where it's this protected bike lane, or not even a lane, protected bike facility just on its own, where people of all ages and abilities would have more access on that facility. And so that's really the concept. And then if we go to the next slide, we can see how this map looks. And so, there's certain places where the gap is less significant. And so those are generally going to be places where the bike network is pretty built out and is pretty robust and high quality and connects people to destinations. But there's other places where the gap exists, and there's destinations and people live there, and there would be usefulness in a good bike network, but it's lacking. So that's what this sort of gap or accessibility gap is showing. And then lastly, next slide, Macy. We look at pedestrian access to destinations. And so this one's sort of similar, but a little bit different. And what we look at here is really the gap of where you can walk just on the network compared to where you theoretically could walk if the network was not a constraint. And the illustrative example I'll provide is, there's places where our highways run through communities, and you might live on one side of that highway, and on the other side of the highway, there's the grocery store that you go to get your food or whatever you need. And so in a lot of cases, this distance isn't huge. You could maybe it's like 500 meters. It's a very walkable distance, but of course you can't just walk across the highway. And this is true of class 1 and class 2 facilities, but even some of our main streets are conventional highways, it's still a gap you wouldn't want to walk across, and there might not be a crosswalk. And so what you'd have to do instead is walk around to the nearest overcrossing, undercrossing, crosswalk where it's safe to go. And in some cases, this can be a massive detour, and this can really increase the time to get to the destinations you need to get to. And so by measuring that gap, so looking at if you could just walk in that 500-meter line to where you need to get to without worrying about the highway versus the reality of where you actually have to walk, this really illustrates where there's major barriers to pedestrian access both through our system or through other impediments. Rivers often can create this situation, railroad tracks, just unconnected street grids or street networks, things like that. And so that's really what we're measuring. And so together, these three access to destination screens are really measuring different types of barriers to access, but they're all really important, and they're all related to non-auto access. And so we combine those together into the access to destinations analysis. So with that, I'll talk a little bit about the screening scenarios. Those were all the individual indicators that we just went over. And we do hope these can be useful in their own right. I mean, they are useful in telling a story and understanding where there's issues. And so we've had a lot of folks use the EQI just for the underlying data sets, not necessarily for the actual screens that we use. But that ultimately is what we've developed. And so, one of the purposes of EQI is to identify, these transportation-based priority populations and specific transportation-related equity areas. And so we have 3 EQI screens that do that, and do that with different sort of combinations of this data to find really specific equity issues that would sort of lead to specific solutions. And so we want to be as direct as possible with that. So the traffic exposure screen of the EQI, highlights places that are low income and or tribal lands, so meet those demographic indicators, but are also places that have high traffic proximity and volume or high crash exposure, or in some cases both, so above the 80th percentile for either of those. So these are really the communities that are receiving the highest burden from the transportation system and the most the negative externalities. Next, the access to destination screen looks at the demographic data, so the low income and tribal lands, but then looks at places where there are significant gaps in access to destinations for people walking, biking, and taking transit. So this is measuring, where are the places that have the most significant access to destinations gaps, where it's also an equity issue. There's plenty of high income places in the state that have lots of access gaps because they don't have good transit and all bike lanes. And there is a certain amount of self-selection there. If people really don't want that, and there's high income community that doesn't provide those things, that might be another issue, but it's not as much of an equity one. So we're really focused on places that are lower income, might have less access to vehicles, or driving at least is going to be a significant cost burden. And so that's why we look at sort of that combination of indicators. And then the last screen here is the transportation-based priority population screen, which looks at the demographic data in combination with both of those other indicators. So both the traffic proximity and volume, crash exposure, and all the access to destination screens. So it's looking at places that are already disadvantaged, are the most burdened by our system, by traffic exposure and crashes, and have the least amount of benefit from it simultaneously. And so this is going to be the sort of narrowest focus here, but it's really where there's a lot of significant transportation equity issues. Next slide. So lastly, before I hand...
I'm sorry to interrupt. This is the
yeah.
interpreter. Has my team arrived? Justin?
Paula, I do not yet see Jessica on.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
All right.
Sorry for the interruption.
Oh, no worries. Just to close us out here, I'll go through some maps that kind of illustrate what these maps actually look like. And so when we look at the demographic indicators, so the low income communities and then the tribal lands, this is fairly broad, and it covers about 45% of the state's population. So it is capturing a lot here. But then once we look at the transportation indicators in conjunction with this data, it just starts to narrow down a little bit. Next slide. So with the traffic exposure screen, Again, this is looking at really where all those externalities are. If you look on the map, it's fairly narrowly focused. It appears to be very narrow geographies, and these are typically ones, along our highway system. But it does represent about 18% of the state's population. So they are typically higher density or higher population dense areas. And it does, represent quite a bit of the state's population, although it's just more narrowly focused in a geographic sense. Next slide. Conversely, the access to destinations data tells a pretty different story. So access to destinations the screen covers about 42% of the state's population as we operationalized it, which makes sense. So it's basically most of the low-income places, or the places that meet the demographic data, also have at least one major gap in access to destinations, because access to destination gaps are just so prevalent across the state. So you can get more specific on this in terms of like where they're occurring, but broadly speaking, it covers quite a big percent of the state's population, and a lot of area just from a spatial sense. But there are some places like in San Francisco and the Bay Area and Los Angeles where they're not included in here despite being low income, because they have fairly high access to destinations. So we want to continue to make that access better, but it might not be the most pressing issue, and to the same degree that like the burdens are. Next slide. And then lastly, the transportation-based priority population screen, again, is kind of a combination of those two things. So, where there are the most amount of burdens and the least amount of benefits. And so as a result of that, it is the most narrowly focused screen. It only covers about 16% of the state's population. And so you can really think of this as where are the places with all those burdens, removing the places that also have high access. And we do find a lot of places like that, for whatever reason, in cities especially, have fairly high access, but also have a lot of burdens from the transportation system. And it's kind of that there's those two things going on. So we account for that. Next slide, please. So there's a few things available right now on the EQI webpage. The first is this EQI web map. And so this essentially just shows what the screens are. And you can go click at any given census block and basically get the data for all the indicators and the screens and whatnot. And it illustrates it here by what screen is shown. Next slide. And then we're also working on a tool internally at this point that's meant to be kind of an EQI project analysis tool. And so we do EQI project analysis in a few ways that I can talk about later. But this one is meant to be a really simple, like anyone can go in and just draw a line for your project and provide some really basic information about what your project is anticipated to do. Maybe it's anticipated to provide greater transit frequency or speed up transit, or in some cases it might be a widening that's going to add a lot more burden. And then based on sort of high level assumptions about what a project is intended to do and where it's located and what the EQI conditions on the ground are, it can make some simple sort of inferences and not really recommendations, but sort of quantify what the impacts might be. So that's another tool we've been developing. And with that, I'd like to hand it back to Macy, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the ongoing use cases we've been working on. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Henry. Yeah, so as far as the use cases, Caltrans, so one is Caltrans System Investment Strategy, called the CSIS, is an investment framework developed by Caltrans to prioritize project. The CSIS aims to operationalize prioritize investment that improve safety, mobility, sustainability, and equity while addressing California's long-term transportation needs. The CSIS includes several quantitative metrics designed to quantify alignment with the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure, called as CAPTI. And two of these metrics utilize the EQI, the disadvantaged community DAC accessibility, and the traffic impact metrics. And second, to support Caltrans districts in the pre-planning process, we are right now working to integrate the EQI into the transportation planning scoping information sheet called as TIPSIS, which is a pre-planning tool used to document proposed project cost, schedule, needs, and opportunities. This integration aims to identify equity needs as early as possible. And next, to support SB 960 implementation, Caltrans defined underserved communities using the demographic overlay in the EQI. And this helps us consistently identify low-income and tribal communities across the state, ensuring they are prioritized for engagement and equitable project planning. And also, we've been collaborating with the Division of Safety to develop potential use cases for the EQI tool and integrate EQI data into their methodologies, as well as enhancing the EQI methodology using the safety data. And we've been engaging with SB1 program to assess whether EQI data is being utilized in their application scoring system. And right now, we are working to develop a step-by-step EQI user guide. And based on our estimated timeline, it will be ready internally for Caltrans staff by spring 2026. And we are trying to explore ways to have the committee review and provide feedback as external users. And that concludes our presentation today. Here is our contact information, the EQI inbox that you can send email for us as far as any questions or any feedback, any thoughts that you have. And I'm not sure if you have time for questions, but we'd be happy to take questions.
Yeah, I think we can take a few quick ones. If anybody has a question that hasn't asked one yet, we can start there. Just because we do want to get to both our presentations, but yeah, if no one else has a question, we can start with Martha.
Yeah, I think Martha has her hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise the question about safety in a lot of these corridors. Like when we're looking at like the whole overall layers that are involved with what you're doing, it's quite an endeavor. But I'm wondering if there's room to add another safety measure, and that would be like understanding like rest stops. What kind of areas do we have to mitigate for the outcomes of those travelers on those paths? Do we have a layer or an indicator for like rumble strips or dividers or things that would kind of show like these are the areas of high impact, but we have rumble strips here, or we have a major divider that secures and buffers those pedestrians or those bicyclists. And the other is lighting, because a lot of the big things that we have in community is understanding lighting. And just recently I came back from San Diego in a neighborhood where there was an crosstown freeway, like over a bridge, so to speak, where they were a walking bridge, and there was no lighting. There wasn't anything there to like ensure the safety of pedestrians. And it was dilapidated. The metal and the cyclone fence that was on the exterior needed to be brought up to speed. So things like that, just understanding some of these infrastructures that are out there that may be like not counted as or overlooked because they're already a completed project but need attention. And the other factor is technology. As we're advancing into other forms of technology, are these corridors, are they able to support or even have the technology that we need, like lighting? Obviously, we can't bring in solar to certain places, but like, is that something that we're considering, or are we looking at what types of different infrastructure or supportive services we have to create those shelters or coverings or awnings? Do we have a map of that? And if we don't, that might be something to be considered, because that creates equity. If you can't safely cross that thoroughfare or that bridge, people don't use it. So that's creating a division and a separation from access to those corridors. So that was all.
Staff want to respond, or I'm happy to ask my question if not.
I can respond just real quick. Thanks, Martha. I think a lot of the factors you're describing are, at least in conversations I've had with Caltrans safety staff, like would be sort of categorized as like these risk factors, things that might not directly be, crash history, but are really important and correlate with, more crashes. And so we've had some preliminary discussions on including more of those things. Especially like lighting is a huge one. We want to look at like speeding. There's a lot of different things there that I think would kind of broadly fall under that category. Consistent data availability does remain an issue, but it is certainly something we're committed to trying to improve on and to where we can incorporate it doing so.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you, Macy, for the presentation as well as answering our questions. And thank you, Martha, for asking really good questions. Mine is also around just how the data is being collected. Just so maybe I'm not understanding the access to destinations component of it, but it seems to me like you're looking at the infrastructure that exists and trying to understand access through that. And if that's the case, I'm curious if there will be future iterations of this that look at big data platforms that collect origin and destination models that actually look at the behavior of travel so that we can sort of compare the infrastructure as well as the behavior to really round out our understanding of how people are currently moving.
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're right. Yeah, we basically, the data we collect is infrastructure data, whether it be like, in some cases, it's like transit schedules or, where the bike lane is and things like that. So basically transportation networks and then land use, like where the destinations are, where people live. And then we perform those routing calculations and essentially do the analysis to calculate access to destinations. The actual metric is really just the potential of like, where can you go because of transportation, and where are those gaps, or where did the gaps exist? So some people do the metrics and like adjust it for sort of where people actually are and like incorporate some of that big data. We don't, just because that big data, reflective of like the current state, is sort of, reflecting what the gaps are. But I think there's definitely use, especially in like post-project implementation. In the CSIS, which Macy pointed to as kind of a use case, we actually go in and we do analysis on the project level of, we go model in, okay, we're going to build this project. How is access to destinations going to change in a very specific sense? And we have certain assumptions and, we can model it and think it's going to get better. And we haven't, at this point, it's not a very mature process. We've only been doing it for about a year. But I think with some of these projects, that would be a great opportunity to kind of actually go in and look at the data and see if we're seeing that change in behavior as a result.
Thank you. Look forward to future analysis on this. This is great effort by Caltrans, and thank you again for your presentation and answering our questions. Since it seems like no other questions from the subcommittee, perhaps we can keep moving the agenda along. I believe next we have agenda item number 6, Assembly Bill 744 update, advancing statewide transportation data tools for local and regional jurisdictions, with presenter Sheila Ennis from CTC's who is CTC's Assistant Deputy Director of Programming on Assembly Bill 744.
Thank you,
Did I get
Naomi.
that
Can you
right?
hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. Let me share my screen. Okay, so we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Sheila Ennis, and I manage the Assembly Bill 744 initiatives at the Commission. So I'm very happy to be here today to provide an overview of Assembly Bill 744, as well as a staff recommendation from the proposal that was approved during our Commission meeting last week. And what a great segue, too, to hear Caltrans EQI is a good example of a tool that's out there for agencies to utilize. So we'll begin with an overview of Assembly Bill 744 itself and why it's important. So Assembly Bill 744 was enacted in 2023, and this bill requires the Commission to convene relevant state, regional, and local agencies in order to assess the procurement and implementation of data, modeling, and analytic software tools, as well as submit a proposal to the state legislature that outlines the following. So there's 3 items: a process for procuring transportation data platforms and granting access to state, local, and regional agencies, or a process for allocating funds directly to those state, local, and regional agencies for the procurement of their own data and tools, or a hybrid option of both. So why is this important? Well, the data and tools will support the state's sustainable transportation, congestion management, affordable housing, efficient land use, air quality, economic, and climate change strategies and goals. So at its core, AB 744 would help ensure that transportation data is used collaboratively and consistently to advance equity, improve coordination, and strengthen accountability across California's planning agencies. So next, we'll take a look at the actual objectives of AB 744, starting with evaluating the tools currently used by local, regional, and state agencies to collect and analyze transportation data. Also, another objective is to gain an understanding of what type of data and tools are still needed by local, regional, and state agencies. And then finally, recommend a path forward that not only addresses those gaps, but also explores different tools or methods that can improve how agencies access the data. So the commission staff conducted a multi-method approach to stakeholder engagement throughout 2024 and 2025. And this included virtual meetings, multiple surveys, and an initial kickoff webinar followed by 3 workshops. I'll cover each section in depth, beginning with the multi-method approach. So after the bill was enacted in October of 2023, commission staff held a virtual kickoff webinar followed by several virtual meetings with local, regional, and state agencies. Multiple surveys were conducted. The first survey focused on identifying the actual data outputs that are being reported and the reporting criteria, such as where the outputs are being reported, how often it's being reported, and what tools are being utilized to assist with reporting efforts. The second survey focused on regional transportation planning agencies and members of the Rural Counties Task Force, and aimed at primarily identifying additional outreach opportunities, preference of funding path, potential challenges that they face that would impede AB 744 implementation, identification of current tools being utilized, as well as for what purpose, and future needs supporting the state transportation and climate goals. The third survey involved members of transportation and housing related state agencies. So as far as the workshops go, in addition to the initial kickoff webinar, commission staff conducted 3 additional workshops to share progress, review data, and preliminary findings, and gather stakeholder feedback on proposed implementation options. Our stakeholders included metropolitan planning organizations, regional transportation planning agencies, members of the Rural Counties Task Force, vendors, other state departments of transportation, and subject matter experts from a diverse group of agencies specializing in transportation planning, housing policy, environmental justice, and data analysis. And each of them brought a critical perspective to help shape our understanding of the bill's implications and needs associated with its requirements. So continued collaboration with these partners, as well as the Equity Advisory Committee, will remain a priority should legislature advance the proposal. So as mentioned earlier, a key objective of AB 744 is to evaluate the current landscape of tools being utilized, as well as agencies' needs specific to implementation of data tools. So with our surveys, some engagement insights related to the assessment identification of data tools were as follows. So the top 3 reported transportation data outputs were travel time, vehicle miles traveled, and safety. The geographic information systems, or GIS, tools such as Esri ArcGIS and QGIS were noted as most widely used. Mobility analytic tools such as Replica, NREX, and Streetlight were popular among metropolitan planning organizations. And for special tools and analytic platforms, metropolitan planning organizations rely more on travel demand modeling tools like Bentley Cube or TransCAD, whereas state agencies use tools such as Google Earth Engine and RStudio for environmental analysis and spatial data integration. It's important to note that the tools I just referenced were identified through stakeholder engagement and represent only a very small sample of existing tools in the industry. So if you'd like to see additional examples that were mentioned during the process, please make sure to check out the draft proposal. Those are in Appendix B. So several common barriers to adopting data and modeling tools emerged across agencies. And these challenges generally fell into a few key categories, which were lack of technical expertise, limited staff resources, budget constraints, and concerns about data redundancy. And then beyond technical challenges, agencies also highlighted financial constraints and procurement challenges, especially among the smaller agencies. So the findings from the stakeholder engagement revealed persistent gaps in data accessibility, funding support, and the standardization of tools and practices across the state. To address these challenges in alignment with the goals of AB 744, Commission staff recommended supporting a hybrid implementation option that combines the benefits of a competitive funding program with the efficiency of centralized procurement. So under this option, a state entity would allocate funds to eligible agencies through a competitive process, giving them the flexibility to procure data and modeling tools that best meet their specific needs. The designated state agency could also explore establishing a mechanism that allows multiple agencies to apply jointly as a consortium. A couple benefits to the hybrid option include agencies would have the choice to either procure tools independently using the awarded funds or opt into centrally procured tools depending on their capacity and needs. Master contracts through the Department of General Services can also be leveraged, which will reduce administrative burden and accelerate the procurement process. Shared licenses and centralized procurement can also lower cost and promote more efficient use of public funds. And then the option to apply jointly enables small or resource-limited jurisdictions to collaborate, share costs, and improve access to advanced tools. And then the smaller and underserved communities would benefit from group procurement opportunities and technical support, helping close the technology gaps. So the proposal itself recommends that the legislature take the following actions, I'll go over them, to support effective implementation. So one being allocate funding to expand statewide access to transportation data, modeling programs, and analytic tools. Two, enable flexible procurement, allowing agencies to choose tools that best meet their needs rather than forcing a one-size-fits-all approach. And then finally, ensure continued stakeholder involvement to inform implementation and support a successful outcome. So the proposal, just a little bit more about the proposal and our next steps. The proposal underwent a 30-day public comment period from June 13th through July 13th of 2025. The feedback that we received focused on prioritizing foundational and widely used tools, encouraging interagency collaboration, and offering general input to help shape future guidance or program guidelines. A clear majority of comment letters expressed support for a flexible hybrid approach that allows agencies to select tools that meets their specific needs. And we received no letters in opposition to this option. The final proposal was approved last week at the commission meeting in San Diego, and a copy of the proposal can be found on the commission's website under AB 744 section. We do anticipate the commission will submit the proposal to legislature by September, and then once submitted, we will continue to monitor the legislative process and stay engaged as it moves forward. So while the proposal will be in the hands of the legislature at that point, the commission will remain involved and continue working with legislative partners to determine whether they wish to advance the proposal or allocate resources for it. So that concludes my update on Assembly Bill 744. I'm happy to answer any questions. Yeah, Martha, go ahead.
No question, just a comment. I think I'm really, really happy and excited about this particular initiative. Um, it's so comprehensive and very intentional about who it helps out. And for many circumstances where the community does not have an opportunity, they can align themselves with academia or even a data source that would be willing to help bring that information. And for myself, being very familiar with qualitative data and the tool of storytelling and how to take qualitative analysis into quantitative analysis, this is exciting because it gives a lot of folks an opportunity to be able to learn and be able to create their own data sourcing pools for information. And that is critical in being able to get funding. So I just give my kudos for that one. Thank you.
Thank you. Naomi?
Florence, do you want to go next? I've already spoken, so.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I'm curious, in the survey of the studies that you completed, in addition to the types of tools that are being used, did you learn about like the quality of the data that's being used, the extent to which it's being integrated, the barriers to accessing and gathering data? I'd love to understand that a bit more.
Specifically the barriers, yes. We
Yeah.
did receive feedback on the barriers, and a lot of that had to do with the technical expertise available.
Mhm.
The time, resources, it was more of a resource limitation. And your other questions, well, repeat these other two real quick. Because I don't think we
ability
had
to
much on that.
access data, ability to integrate data.
I think that kind of goes back, it's all inclusive, right? Ability to
Mhm.
access the data has to do with, in many cases, the funding. And then the
Yeah.
technical expertise. We heard from several agencies that sometimes they have to go to consultants to get that data. And then they have the ability to analyze it as far as intellectually, but they don't have the time. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful. I think that from a perspective of like what is feasible, I think that it seems like it will be really helpful to be able to provide data or provide funding for the communities to be able to use new data tools. I think that's exciting, but just like that basics of being able to collect data and have resources to collect and have clean data, it seems like that will need to be a priority too in a lot of communities.
100%, and that's kind of the standardizing the data and making it not redundant and ensuring it's clean for sure. Thank you.
Any other members have a question before I ask mine? Okay. Thank you, Sheila, for the presentation. Echoing Martha's comments that this is great. I'm really excited about it. Would you be able to say more on any barriers or challenges that came up with interagency coordination around this? I could only imagine what a pain it might be for different agencies to try to coordinate and share data with each other, and even just if they're given the flexibility of utilizing tools that meet their unique needs, is there even an opportunity to share and sort of take advantage of economies of scale with data? Like, sorry, I know I asked a question and I'm continuing to talk, but
That's
I think
okay.
a lot of Martha's comments, around understanding things that are really like a local data point, like near misses or rumble strips, or those types of things. If local agencies or jurisdictions or community members have that data, is there a way, or even at the project level, like Henry was talking about with the ECI, is there a way to standardize a way or have a clearinghouse or something like that, that these different California agents, like California, not state, but like reside in California agencies, can then have access to data that someone in another part of the state may be utilizing or analyzing without having to, get a consultant to look at and pull the same data that somebody else has already pulled?
Sure, I think that's the goal of Assembly Bill 744, and hopefully providing it passes, that's something that we can kind of build into guidelines as far as sharing that information, knowing where to find that information. The interagency collaboration is really interesting, Naomi, because I think a lot of people, they want to collaborate. It's just maybe we don't know what we don't know, right? Where to go to ask the questions, to find the information, that kind of thing. That's what I'm kind of seeing throughout this whole endeavor. So once the bill or the proposal is passed, we'll be able to kind of fine tune accessibility as far as statewide to data and tools. And there are some tools out there that are free right now. It's just very difficult to find. So I think there's going to be more to come on that.
Okay. Is CTC the best position agency to kind of play sort of like a overview or convener role with that? Or
I think right now that's part of what the legislature is going to determine as well with the proposal. Because of limited resources, it'll be interesting to see what they come back with as far as a suggestion or questions or anything like that. But that's to be determined as well. Sorry.
thank you very much.
Great questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions for Sheila? If not, thank you again, Sheila, for the great presentation and answering our questions.
Thank you.
So I believe that brings us to just wrapping up and next steps for this meeting. Oh, actually, Clerk, do we have quorum to revisit the minutes?
Let me double check. And yes, we do. Yes, this would be a good time to do that.
Okay, let's do it. So does Florence have to re-motion her motion to approve the June minutes?
Yeah, let's do that again.
I re-motion my motion.
I'm making up words, I apologize.
I'll second.
Thank you, Commissioner Armas Kelly. Can she,
Oh,
Yeah,
wait, can I even do that?
right. Not as an ex officio member.
Oh,
thank
okay.
you, I'm sorry. Would anyone else like to second?
No, that's good. I thought I couldn't vote, but I knew it. I didn't know if I could second. That's right. It's voting.
I can second.
Thank you, Carrie. I think, was that Carrie? Okay, thank
Yes, that
you.
was me.
Okay, thank you. Do I pass to the clerk now for ayes? Okay.
Yes. So I will now call the roll. Carrie Kimi Hernandez,
Aye.
Abamel Chavez Hernandez,
Aye.
Florence Simon,
Aye.
Chair Iwasaki.
Aye.
All right. Chair, the motion passes.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Thank you. So, you know, I guess I'll close our meeting with just a thank you to everyone who took time out of their day to present to us, to join this commission meeting as staff and as a member. This is my first time chairing, so I'm sorry that I may have missed some protocols or anything like that. But I'm really excited and encouraged to see members on this subcommittee who are really engaged in a lot of the policies that we're hearing about and want to learn more and dive into these questions. I think data is really important to be able to make informed decisions. And of course, in combination with the other subcommittees like community engagement, because we want it to be ground truth and we want to ensure that the data that we are collecting, we're slicing it the right way, we're getting it from the right sources, and that we're not leaving anybody out. Am I getting the hook, Sequoia?
No, I just wanted to see if there was any public comment.
Oh, okay. Is there any public comment?
Not seeing any request to comment at this time.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You did. You're doing great, man.
You did awesome.
Thank you. I do, just to that last point, and then I'll wrap it up because I'm standing in the way of everyone logging off, is if there is, I guess, protocol or an opportunity for subcommittees to do a joint meeting together, I do think that it would be interesting to have the Community Engagement Committee and the Data Implementation subcommittees kind of hear similar policies together and kind of bring different viewpoints, because I do think that those viewpoints enrich each other. So just throwing that out there for consideration, and maybe I can talk with staff offline about the possibility of that.
Good job. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Do we need a motion to adjourn? Or is there anything else? Sorry, my little chair cheat sheet ran out at this point, so I'm not sure what the next step is. I'm sorry.
No, a motion's not needed.
Okay, great. Well then, thank you everyone for joining this meeting and look forward to the next time we all convene. Please stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Great work.
Naomi.
you.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.